I've previously described how to create an XML layout file and describe the visual objects in the layout with XML code. But you can also add objects to a layout at runtime with Java code. And I'll describe how to do this with the project Layouts with Code. The starting layout for this project, activitymain.xml, has a linear layout at its root. In order to add objects with Java code, you'll need to get a reference to the layout. To get the reference, you'll need to assign it a unique ID. In the activity main file, I'll add an attribute to this linear layout tag. It'll be an ID attribute. I'll type ID and press Control Space and choose Android:ID. In order to assign a new unique ID, always use this syntax: @+ID/. The @ character means you're creating a new resource. The plus means you're creating a new ID from scratch rather than referencing an existing ID. And the ID means that you're referencing the ID collection of resources. Now, assign the unique ID, and I'll just call it layout. When you save that change, that ID will be added to the automatically generated R class, and you'll be able to reference it from your Java code. Now go to the main activity.java file. You'll find it in the app's default package. In order to add visual objects to the layout at runtime in a way that will make them appear when the activity first becomes visible, add the code in the onCreate method. This method will be called automatically by the framework as the activity comes to the screen. I've already assigned the ID to the layout. Now I'll get its reference in Java code. I know that my layout has a root of linear layout, and so I'll use a Java class that maps to that XML element. The name of the class and the name of the XML element are the same. I'll type linear layout, and then I'll press Control Space. In Eclipse, that'll cause an import statement for that class to be added to my code. And now I can reference the layout and manage it. I'll give the linear layout object a name of simply layout. To get a reference to the layout or to any other visual widget, use a method called findViewById. This is a method that's a member of the activity class, so you don't need to give it a prefix. You're asked to pass in an integer value, and typically you'll get that from the R class that's dynamically generated. For the ID of a view, use r.id and then select the ID of the object you want to work with. I'll choose layout. The findViewById method says that it's returning an instance of the view class, but you can return any view or any subclass of a view. You'll still see this warning, though, that you have a type mismatch, and this is telling you that you have to downcast the return value to match what you declared. The easiest way to do this in Eclipse is to press Ctrl+1 on Windows or Command+1 on Mac and add a cast to the return value of findViewById. You'll be doing this a lot in your Android coding. It's a good thing to remember that Eclipse will handle the process for you, but you do need to add the downcasting code. So now I have a reference to the layout, and I can add objects to it. And I'll create a new view object. I'll create a button. I'll type the name of the Java class button, and once again press Control Space, and that adds an import for the button class. I'll name this object simply button, and I'll instantiate it using the button class's constructor method. There are 3 versions of this constructor method, and I'll use the simplest one. No matter which one you use, whenever you create a new view object in code, you need to pass in something called the context. The context class is the superclass of the activity class, and my current class, main activity, extends activity. So I'm going to tell the framework this button is a part of this context or this activity, and I'll do that by simply typing in this. And now this button object can be used anywhere in this activity, but nowhere else. Once you've created the button, you can set certain properties. For example, I'll call a method called setText. There are a number of versions of this method. I'll use one that takes an integer, a resource ID, and I'll pass in the ID of a string resource that's already a part of the strings.xml file of this project. with r.string.clickMe. You can use any other string value you like. So now I've created the button object, and I've set its text value, which is the caption that will appear on the face of the button. And I'm ready to add the button to the layout. To do that, I'll call a method of the layout object called addView. And again, there are a few different versions, and I'll use the simplest one. And where I'm asked to pass in a view object, I'll pass in my button. And again, button is extended from view, and so you can pass it into this method. And that's it. Those are the steps. You get a reference to the layout, you create your visual object in code, and you add it to the layout. I'll save and run my code, and when the app comes to the screen in the emulator, it shows that the button has been created. By default, the button is filling the width of the layout, and there's all sorts of methods of the view object that you could use to resize it or reposition it. But for the last exercise, I'll show you that you can add multiple objects. And because this is a linear layout with an orientation of vertical, the objects will simply stack one on top of another. I'll place the cursor above the code that's creating the button, and I'll create a for loop. I'll type for and press Control Space and choose the first code template. Then I'll change this code so that I'm looping through the code 3 times. Next, I'll take this code that's creating the button and adding it to the layout, and I'll cut it to the clipboard and paste it within the for loop. So now I'm creating 3 buttons and adding them each to the view. I'll save and run the code again, and this time when the app appears in the emulator, I have 3 buttons. So I encourage you to experiment with this type of code. For the most part in this course, I'll be using XML layouts, but there are many cases in an Android app where you need to modify the layout at runtime. And in this exercise, I've shown you how to get a reference to an object, whether it's a layout, a button, or any other kind of view, and how to add views to layouts, all with Java code.